I would say that Venice is probably the place that in Italy most people dream of more than any other. I took my 9-year-old son, as Jean mentioned to you, to Italy this summer, and I asked him, of all the places in the world that you want to go, where do you want to go? And he said Venice first, without any question. And the reason is because, of course, it's a magical dream for most people. I had a boyfriend in college who said, oh, you know, you should go to Venice because the first thing you think when you walk out of the train station, you just can't believe it's water. You can't believe the streets are made with water. And I have to tell you, it's true. When you get there, you step out of the train station and you go, wait a second. I mean, I knew that intellectually, but then when you see, it's a city that floats on water. It's something pretty spectacular. I'm imagining a few of you have been there. How many people have been to Venice? Most of you, yes. So you're here not just to enjoy slides, but to kind of relive, I think, something that you might have already enjoyed in the past. And that's the thing, is once you get a taste of this city, it's really hard to ever let it go, because it really does speak to you on a sort of soulful level, if you find the right sort of vibe. So here is Italy. Italy is a country that actually is quite young. It's only been a country for about 150 years. And Veneto is the one up in the very top corner up there. And the Veneto is unique in Italy in that it was one of the very last regions to join. It sort of joined almost unwillingly at the very end of the Risorgimento in the 1870s. And that is because they had a really specific identity. So in the past, if you went to Italy, let's say you went to Italy in the year 1800, before that, let's say 1700, you went to Italy, you would see that this was not one country, but a whole bunch of different kingdoms. And I'm telling you this because it's important to know that around that time, 1700, Venice comprised a huge section up there, not just the city, but it was a large territory. And at that point, the Venetian Republic was declining, but it was an independent republic. It had been an independent republic for almost 1,000 years when Napoleon marched in around the year 1800 and took its independence away. That doesn't seem maybe as impressive to you as it may seem at the face of it, but consider that really there has been no other place on earth that is an independent republic controlled by the citizens for 1,000 years. Can you think of any other place like that? I can think of other civilizations that have existed for that long, but very few have existed for 1,000 years as a republic run by the people of the city. So it became quite a large territory and eventually was joined into the Italian state as it exists today. If you ever go to Rome, just to kind of give yourself a little clue to look for, there's a main square in Rome called Piazza Venezia. Have you heard of that before? Big square, it's the one where Mussolini was out on his balcony talking to the people. The reason it's called Piazza Venezia is that's where the Venetian embassy was in the past, because it was a different country. It was its own country. I tell you all this as a preface because I want you to understand that Venetians don't think of themselves as Italians. They think of themselves as Venetians. And they have a right to feel very different, because if you see how far Venice is from Sicily, which was the place that we visited last year in this class, these people are mostly Greek, Arab, people with a completely different DNA string than the people from Venice. The people from Venice, look how far north they are. They're close up to the Alps. So they're going to be people who are a lot more mixed with Germanic people, but considering it was an international city, a Venetian person can have blood from anywhere. A typical Venetian has blonde hair and blue eyes. It's true, even today. I can pick out Venetians by sitting in a cafe, and if you see a person with blonde hair and blue eyes speaking a particular kind of dialect that sounds nothing like Italian, that's a Venetian for you. So even today, they think of themselves as their own country. So here is a little bit more about the Veneto region. So you can see everything here that's in yellow is the Veneto region, all the way over as far as Verona. In the past, it actually went way farther over towards Milan, all the way over almost to Lake Como. So it was a huge territory. So today, as a state, as the state of the Veneto, it comprises one of the largest areas in Italy, and it also has some of the most strong economic sort of factors there. They have a lot of manufacturing. It's very, very strong in terms of economics. And they also are one of the largest wine producing regions in all of Italy. So they have a lot of great things going for them. They actually are also home to a separatist movement. There's a lot of people there that would like to secede from Italy. They'd like the Veneto and maybe some of the other northern states of Italy to create their own economic territory, because they are so much stronger than some of the other territories in Italy. So the city of Venice itself is where all of this begins, though. So we're going to take a look today just at the city and understand sort of how it grew and why it's important. The first thing I love about it is it's shaped like a fish. Do you see that? Probably not on purpose, I doubt, but the city is shaped like a fish. You can see that imagine the nose is here. This is a man-made island that came later. Let's say the nose is here and the tail is up there. The tail is where the military complex is. And so if you look at the Grand Canal, it almost seems like the Grand Canal, it's like feeding a fish through the mouth, and the Grand Canal is like the intestines, right? And look where the intestines come out. That's the political center of the city. Nothing changes in history, does it? And this is a true thing. So this is how the city is set up. The Grand Canal is the main street. The city itself is made up of about 118 individual islands. So today you can walk through Venice. I can walk through Venice probably one end to the other in about a half hour to 45 minutes. It might take you more like 2 or 3 hours because you can't quite find your way. But imagine that before Venice entered the country of Italy, and there was an Austrian occupation at a certain point, each of those islands was an actual individual island. So each of these little kind of squares you see on here used to be a self-contained island. There were no bridges. So that means that people had to take boats between each of the islands, and that meant also that every one of those little islands needed to have a church, a well, and it needed to have sort of all the things you would need to live. So some people could live in Venice and never leave their little tiny island. So that's how it was in the distant past. It was absolutely individual islands. Just a couple of other things the way about how it's made. This is the Giudecca Island, which is today mostly just a residential island. A lot of famous people live there, like Elton John lives there. And the island up here on the very top, that white one, that's San Michele, which was nothing in the past, but was turned by Napoleon into the funeral island. So they removed all of the bodies from all of the churches. Can you imagine burying somebody in a churchyard in Venice? Consider that when you bury somebody, what are you burying them in? Well, it's, kind of sandy, muddy water. So it was pretty unsanitary, and there were a lot of diseases that went through Venice over the years. And so when Napoleon came and he took the city, he decided to reorganize and clean it. He tore down a bunch of churches that were falling apart and got rid of all of the bodies and put them out on San Michele. And so today, if you go out there, that's where Venetians are typically buried at. So just a couple of other things to think about when you look at the city. This city was nothing in the past. This city was marshy islands. Now, one thing that a lot of people misunderstand about Venice is they think that Venice was something that was built on water, that they just put stilts in the middle of the water and built a platform and built a city. That's not at all the case. Venice was built on marshy, sandy islands that already existed, but were kind of a little bit squishy, so they had to reinforce them by driving big pilings into the ground. And what did they use? They're right at the base of the Alps. They used trees. They would cut off trees and use the tree trunks and pound them down into the ground, and they would use those as a way to build the platforms. So this entire city, if you can imagine, is built on a forest. So think about that. Every single building has a forest of tree trunks underneath it. That's what they use as the foundations. Now you might think, oh, that sounds terrible. Isn't the city good? That's why Venice is sinking, clearly, is because it's built on a forest. That's not the case at all, though, because all of those tree trunks are underwater, and they're completely sealed off from air, and so they're slowly being petrified. I think they said that we need something like 10,000 more years. But in 10,000 years, all of those tree trunks that were buried over 1,000 years ago will turn into stone eventually because they never have contact with oxygen. So that's how the city is built. It's just built on platforms. This is not the first city, though. The very first city actually was built on an island called Torcello, which is in the far north of the lagoon, and people came out there around the year 600 to escape from Attila the Hun. And they found that, of course, barbarians can't swim, which is fabulous, so they started there. But the problem with Torcello is Torcello had bad air. They started there, they moved a city, literally moved a city called Altino from the mainland, brick by brick, and they built a whole new city out in the lagoon and found that people were dying from bad air. Do you know how to say bad air in Italian? Malaria. Malaria. That's where we get the word malaria from, it was the Venetian dialect of saying that there's bad air. You speak Venetian and you don't even know it. We're going to find out through it. No, you do. As we go through this talk, you're going to find out that you know a lot of words and you speak them because they come from Venetian dialect. The city has had so much of an effect. So they moved the city brick by brick, literally taking the city from one island to the next, and they moved it several times. If you go to Torcello today, you don't see any of the original city, because they couldn't make new bricks, new stones, and things like that during the time of these Gothic invasions. So they kept moving the city around until they decided to establish it right here. That's at the Rialto. If you've ever been to Venice to Rialto, Rialto Rivis Altus, which means the high point in the city. So that's where the city was started around the year 800. 800 is a nice round number to remember. And that's when they started an independent Venetian republic. And from that point on, we have 1,000 years of rule by the people of the city of Venice. You got that? 1,000 years of history? You all good? Okay, good. Then we can proceed. So the main center, that political center, it takes place in St. Mark's Square. So this is, of course, the most famous thing that you probably have seen in Venice, the Church of St. Mark's. Don't misunderstand what this is, though. A lot of people come here and go, oh, it's the Cathedral of Venice. No, this is the Basilica of St. Mark's. This was the private chapel of the leader of Venice, the Doge. The Doge was a person who was picked from amongst all of the most wealthy families of Venice, and it was picked by a vote. In the initial stages, they would actually just start yelling out somebody's name until everybody started yelling the same name, which is such an Italian concept. Can you imagine? Everybody in town getting together in a square, just yelling names until all of the people are chanting the same name. That's how it was called an orengo, and that's how they started to choose this person called the Doge or Duke or leader. It doesn't really mean the same thing as Duke. It's more like the leader. The leaders were always chosen for a lifetime term, and they were usually chosen when they were at least about 80 years old. Why do you think they were chosen when they were 80 years old? Because it's a lifetime term, of course. Venetians, though, they live quite old. One of the most famous Venetian Doge, he lived until he was about 95. So they still got some good terms out of these Doge. So the people who lived here and ruled, these kind of kings, they weren't really kings, but they were leaders. This was their political chapel. It was the private chapel. And it, of course, is the most beautiful and famous and all of that, but isn't that an interesting statement to have made? And that's the important thing to understand about Venice, first of all, is that Venice, above all, was a political city. It was not a city that was driven by religion because it was not connected to the Vatican. If you go any place else in Italy, you go to Padova, you go to Bologna, you go down even to the south, Naples, it doesn't really matter. The Pope had some sort of effect. He had some rule because, of course, he's the religious leader. The people of Venice specifically chose not to have a connection to the Vatican because they wanted to be able to follow their favorite god, which was gold, you know. This is their god. This is why they were there. So in the initial stages, when they were sort of starting to establish their independence, there were two major powers in the world at that time. There was the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, the German king in the north, Charlemagne, of course, and all of the people who came after him. The forces of Charlemagne and his sons tried to dominate the city of Venice, and they attacked it with ships. They came into the lagoon, and they failed miserably. The Venetians were able to board their boats and kill them all because they had something going for them that the people from the north didn't know. And that it's not boats. Of course, Charlemagne's forces, his son's forces, had boats. The problem is that the Venetians have a really shallow lagoon. It doesn't look shallow, but it's only about knee-deep on average. So that map I showed you of the city, all of that water around there is knee-deep on average. So if you sail in there with a giant fleet, they're going to do this over and over again. Every time some force tries to come in to destroy them, they run aground, and then the Venetians, it's like picking off people as easily as possible. They just float out there on their boats with their weapons, and they kill everybody, and it's over. So because of that, it became understood that this was a city that couldn't be dominated. So what happened is that the Pope tried to dominate them, the Holy Roman Emperor tried to dominate them, and it was understood that it was never going to happen. So what do? They decided to ally themselves with another force of the world at the time, and that was Istanbul, Constantinople, as it was in the past. Okay, so just to give you a very complicated history lesson, Rome falls, let's say around 400, they move. The emperors, the Roman emperors, had already moved about 50 years before and started a new empire in the east. So that, Constantinople, was very powerful at the time. It was a continuation of the Roman Empire, but the Pope is the one left on the mainland to take over the city of Rome. So the nations look at sort of the main powers going on at the time, and they say, we don't want to be under the Holy Roman Emperor. We don't want to be under the Pope. Let's be under Constantinople. Let's be a child state of Constantinople. And so that was the agreement that was made. They became a child state of Constantinople, which was nice because how far away is Constantinople? They had effectively no rule over Constantinople. Also, another thing that was really nice, once you have that tie to Constantinople, that was the main intersection for trade from the Far East. So if you wanted silks or spices or anything from the Far East, it had to come through Constantinople, which meant they got a better deal than other cities at the time for getting better prices to ship goods up into Northern Europe. So do you see how this all works? This is the thing, is that Venice was independent because it wanted to be independent for business reasons above all. So that's a long way to say that this church is not a cathedral. It wasn't in the past, at least. This was a political church. They wanted to make sure that the most important and beautiful church in all of the city had no sort of domain with the Pope. The Pope had nothing to do with this church. This was owned by the Doge, and normal people couldn't go in there. It was only for guests of the Doge. Now, why it's an important church is that inside are the bones of a very famous saint, and that is Saint Mark. I'll show you the inside. Oh, sorry, from the top. From the top, you can kind of see here that it doesn't really look like a Christian building, does it? Does this look a little more like a mosque to you? Yeah. Easy reason for that. This is quite an old building. This is a building that's over 1,000 years old. And this was a building that was built by architects, artisans from Constantinople. And this is the style of Christian buildings in Constantinople at the time. We associate them with Muslim buildings because Constantinople fell to the Turks. And eventually all of those churches in Istanbul were converted into mosques. So Hagia Sophia, which we think of as the most famous mosque in the world, was never built for that purpose. It was built to be a Christian church. So this style of architecture was Christian when it was built, but then it changed over time because of the occupation of the Turks. So this is a building that has a really interesting and unique style of architecture. And it was started around the year 600 and then changed. It burned down and changed over time. So about 1,000 years ago, just to kind of make it a nice round number, is when this building was built and then modified. The domes, actually, if you took off these funny high ones, they're just made of sort of a framework with lead over the top. The domes are actually quite low. And they look exactly like Hagia Sophia if you've ever been to Istanbul, if you were able to take those off. There's a model inside of the church that shows you what the original building looks like. But they needed to make it more beautiful, so they made these armatures that go over the top to make it so it kind of would be even more impressive than it was to begin with. When you look at this, you may think, this is a little much, isn't it? It's kind of a little over-decorated. It's got all kinds of marble. Think about how heavy this building must be. Most buildings in Venice are made of bricks and wood. And this is made of bricks and wood as well, but all of that marble on the outside has made it sink over time. And in fact, this church is the lowest point in the city of Venice. So if there's ever a flood, this is what floods first. The porch, as you walk in, you have to step over and in, and the portico, that's where the floods always start in Venice. The water bubbles up through the stones, and that's where it starts. So let's have a look on the inside. On the outside here. We have all these different colorful marbles here, and we have some beautiful mosaics. The mosaics are so lovely. I have a particular interest in the mosaics because the mosaics are an art form that started in ancient Rome, moved to Constantinople with the emperors, and then eventually came back to Italy. So we're going to see in a second some of these beautiful glass mosaics. And Venice became very famous for producing the little tessere, the little tiles that they make for the mosaics. But what I want you to notice here is all of these strange colors. Do you see what a mishmash it is? Isn't that odd? If you're going to make the most important church in a big city that's a very important city, why would you make it such a mishmash? Well, it's because it's all stolen. It's all junk that they stole. And we don't know where it came from initially. It's very possible that these things come from ancient Rome, actually. So the story with the exterior is that, let's go back to the emperors. Constantine is the one who, around 330, decides to move from Rome to start a new empire in the east at Constantinople. When he moves, and he takes his whole court with him, he takes stuff with him too. He's going to take temples. He's going to take columns. He's going to take sculptures. Everything he's got, he's going to literally move things from Rome to Constantinople, build beautiful new things. And if you go to Constantinople to Istanbul, you'll see the Hippodrome, for instance, all of these other things that come from the early Roman emperors who lived there. Now, if you fast forward past that time, let's go about 900 years to about the year 1200, the Venetians get into a big scuffle with Constantinople over trade. It's kind of a long story, but basically the emperor, the Roman emperor who's there around the year 1200, is sort of a fraud. And the Venetians back an alternate emperor, and they go to Constantinople, and they basically crush the city, and they sack the city. And when they do that, they install their own emperor, which politically makes a lot of sense for them. So they have control of the city. It's called the Fourth Crusade. And the Doge at the time was that famous one who was, I think, 95 and blind when he led the attack on the city. So if all of you sitting in this room right now think that you're done, that's no excuse. Enrico Dandolo was out there doing it in his 90s. He took it was kind of a failed crusade. They were supposed to go to Jerusalem, but they didn't get enough soldiers. And so they took an opportunity that came when this other emperor who had been usurped needed help to try and regain control of the city, because otherwise the city would have gone bankrupt. They put so much money into this crusade to Jerusalem, so they had to divert in another way to try and get the money to repay for all the ships and things. So they went and they attacked Constantinople. They sacked Constantinople around the year 1200, and unfortunately this kid emperor that they installed had promised them all of the money to repay the cost of this crusade. But when they got there, this teenager is like, yeah, I don't have any money, sorry. So what are you going to do? You've paid all this money for these ships, thinking you're going to get repaid when you sack the city. So they did what you think they did. They stole everything. They took everything they could get their hands on. When they did that, they brought all of these things back into Venice, and they wanted to show that they were now the masters of Constantinople. They wanted to show that the child state had now become the parent. And so they took all of these things that they stole from Constantinople and pasted them like a patchwork. And these are very well columns that probably came from ancient Rome. They're made of porphyry, which was a type of granite that was only used in the temples and the palaces of Roman emperors. It was specifically used for them. It's something that doesn't even exist. You can't go find it anymore. So because of that, we know that this is probably came from Rome, went to Venice, or went to Constantinople, then came back to Venice. And now this is being used as a political statement. That's why it's so messy and patchworky, is that they want you to know when you walk into this basilica, the person who owns this basilica, it's their private chapel, this is the person who also owns Constantinople. So it's hard for us to look at this and read this as such a political statement, but this was a billboard to anybody else who visited in the Middle Ages. They would know that when they came in. So I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit of a big story, but that's how Venice goes from being a fishing village in the year 800 to the masters of the universe in 1200. They were the most important and wealthy city in Europe in the 1200s. And that's how they did it, by crushing Constantinople, okay? So the entry into the church, that's why they're so decorated. The interior is meant to impress you as well, of course. So the interior, I am obsessed with this kind of artwork. This is these mosaics are Byzantine mosaics. So these are artisans that came from Constantinople and did these wonderful mosaics made of little tiny glass tessera that are all about the size of your pinky. So if you can imagine wallpapering your entire house with tiles the size of your pinky, that's about what we're talking about here. And most of these are made with glass that has a layer of gold sandwiched in between. So if you can imagine, it's gold leaf. It's quite extraordinary. This is not an unusual style of art, though. This was all over Istanbul at the time, and Constantinople had tons of churches like this. If you go south to Ravenna, you'll also see art in the same style. The reason I find it so compelling is that this is art that comes from a Roman tradition. If you go to Rome, you're going to see mosaics. Have you ever been to Rome and seen mosaics? Some of you may have. Last year when I talked about Sicily, I talked about the Villa del Casale, which had these huge floors full of beautiful mosaics made of semi-precious stones. This is the kind of thing. That was a tradition that was started in ancient Rome. Those artisans moved to Constantinople, continued that trade, and then they brought it back to Venice. So one thing that I think is a real misunderstanding in the way that we're taught history is that we don't know about that. Our word Byzantine means something needlessly complicated that we don't understand, doesn't it? That's what that word means in English. But Byzantine is just this lost piece of European history that lived in the East that you were never taught about, most likely. So I find it really interesting to look at these Byzantine mosaics and anything that comes from that period, because we're just blind. We're blind to that history. So when we're able to take a look at these mosaics and see this craftsmanship that was going on during the time that we've been told they were the Dark Ages in Europe. Were they dark? It wasn't dark, it's just the light was somewhere else. You know, somebody took the flashlight from Rome and moved over to Constantinople, but somebody forgot to tell you that sometime. So now you know, and this is part of my mission with studying these mosaics, is that I think it's important for people to understand more that there were no Dark Ages. It's just that the light moved. So the light comes back to Constantinople and to Venice, and Venice truly is the light of the world during the 12 and 1300s. So the interior of the church is sort of meant to overwhelm and impress you, but the most important part of the church is what's underneath the altar, and that's the bones of St. Mark. And that's kind of a wonderful story, actually, because Venice was really a rising power in the 800s, 900s, but they didn't have a very interesting saint. Their saint was Saint Theodore. Have you heard of Saint Theodore? No. Nobody else had either. So the Venetians felt they were a little more important than that. And so they decided that they needed to have a more important patron saint. So they looked through the Gospels and tried to find what would be the perfect saint. And they found a connection. Saint Mark, allegedly, of course, one of the four evangelists, he, at some point, they think, came through the Venetian lagoon. Venice didn't exist at the time, but don't tell the Venetians that. And he was on his way through the lagoon to go up to Aquileia, which was an important city at the time. And when he did that, he floated on a boat. The story goes that he fell asleep in the boat, and he had a dream or possibly a vision of an angel saying to him, "Mark, this is where your bones will rest." Now, you can interpret that a couple of different ways. You can interpret that as, you must be tired from your long journey. Have a nap. Okay, but the Venetians interpreted it as being, "Mark, this is where your bones, when you die, will rest." So they felt that they had the right to his bones. Problem is, he didn't die in Venice. He died in Alexandria. So they needed to go find him. So they sent out traders, Venetian traders, down to Alexandria, and they went and found the bones of St. Mark. Great, you got the bones of St. Mark. How are you going to get them home? Are you going to be able to get them past customs? I can't even get candy bars through customs, Kinder eggs. I mean, how are you going to get bones of St. Mark through customs? So they do exactly the thing the only thing they could do. They decided to hide them. But how do you hide them from Muslim customs agents? In a big barrel full of pork. And that's exactly what they did. They got a barrel full of pork, they buried the bones of St. Mark in the barrel, and they got it through customs that way. And the sort of visions of this account have these guys in turbans kind of going, ew, like this, because they open up the barrel and they see that it's pork, and they can't inspect it because they can't touch the pork. Put the lid back on, and they sent the traders back to Venice. And that's how they smuggled the bones of St. Mark back to the church. So now they have one of the four evangelists, which is great, which really upsets the Pope, because the Pope should have dominion over these bones, should have some power over where these bones are laying. But that was the statement of the Venetians. Ha ha, we have St. Mark and you don't. So it made them a very important city. Problem is, a few years later, this church burns down to the ground. Ashes, nothing left, including the bones. So what do you do as a city? You need a miracle really badly. So they rebuild the church, and on the consecration of the church, one of the columns cracks open, and the arm of St. Mark falls out. Isn't that a wonderful miracle? It was just exactly when they needed it as well. So the Venetians will tell you that under that altar still are the bones of St. Mark, and that's exactly what happened. So I leave that up to your faith. It's a matter of faith. So, as with a lot of, I am Catholic, but I have to tell you, as with a lot of these, the relics, it is a matter of faith, whether they are the real thing or not. I leave it up to you. They say if you assembled all the pieces of the true cross, it would be the size of a redwood. So, I don't know. Now, you may recognize these horses. These are some of the most stolen art in the world. These poor horses have been all over the place. In fact, they've been so many places we don't actually know where they come from. There's absolutely no art historian who can tell you, and if they do tell you, they're full of it, because we don't know where these came from. So these horses are the horses that were on the terrace of St. Mark's Basilica. These are the originals. Now they have replicas that are out on the terrace. These horses came from Constantinople, from the Hippodrome, for sure. They were brought during the Fourth Crusade in the 1200s, put here onto the church as a way to sort of make them more important and more beautiful. You can see all these scratch marks all over them, scratched into the gold. They used to have gold leaf over the bronze. That was done on purpose, because when they brought them from Constantinople, they were too shiny, and their shininess competed with the gold outfit of the Doge. And he would stand up there and ride them, look like he was riding them as sort of a symbol to the city during processions. And they thought it was too distracting that the horses were so golden, so they scratched some of the gold off just to deflect it a little bit. So we don't actually know, though, where they came from originally. We know for sure that they had ruby eyes. They had ruby eyes during the time of the height of the Venetian Empire, but they disappeared because Napoleon borrowed them for a little while. Napoleon, when he dominated the city in the 1800s, took these to Paris and put them on top of an arch that is in the gardens of the Louvre. You may have seen it before. And so when you think of the great arches in Paris, don't you think of horses on top? In your imagination, it's these horses. Napoleon took them, and then once he was exiled, they were given back to Venice. Unfortunately, Venice lost a lot of art to Napoleon. So if you really want to upset a Venetian, tell them how much you like Napoleon, because they, even to this day, Venetians, actually Italians in general, have memories that go for generations. So if you talk to a Venetian today about Napoleon, they will talk about him like he is somebody who died 2 days ago. And they'll tell you how horrible he was because he destroyed churches and he took a bunch of artwork. And if you go to the Louvre, you'll see lots and lots of Venetian artwork there that was taken by Napoleon as he felt he had a right to it. So before, in the past, before Constantinople, this is the real interesting part of the mystery, is that we don't know how they got to Constantinople. Some people say they came from ancient Rome. They were made in ancient Rome. There are certain things about it that say that. It's the shape of the eyes tell us possibly that that's indicative of Roman artisans. But there's also other characteristics about these horses that say they could have been Greek. But there are other characteristics that also say they could have been Arab. We don't know. That's the thing. They could have been made 3,000 years ago. We don't have a date on them. Absolutely, we can track that they were at least Roman. They were likely in Rome and then later moved to Constantinople. But I think this is the cool thing about history and art, is the fact that we don't know everything and things are being discovered all the time. So maybe someday they'll find the rubies and maybe someday they'll figure out where they came from. Can you imagine these with rubies in the eyes, though? What a fearsome sight. It must have been really beautiful. So the Doge himself lives in this palace here in the past. And when you look at the architecture, you may think, gosh, that's a strange looking building. It looks like, have you ever been to Disneyland and gone on a Small World? It looks like that, doesn't it? It's exactly the same because he copied that architecture. But really, when you look at it, there's no other building built at the time that this building was built. This building was kind of added onto over time, but you can put it around, let's say, 1300s. There's no other building you're going to find anywhere that has this strange shape, where you have the arches on the bottom and a big block on the top. Isn't that kind of a funny thing? There's a couple of different reasons for that. One of them is just sort of purpose-built, because this big block up here is one of the largest meeting rooms in all of Europe. They needed that because as time went on, all of these people who voted on the different legislation, the rules of Venice, it got to be a lot of people. They had representatives from all the noble families in Venice, and so they needed a giant space to meet in since it was a republic. So there's a room I'll show you in a second that was built that needed to be big and boxy like that. If you see the top, what I want you to imagine is, what would happen if you flipped this building over and set it in the water? It would look like a boat, right? That's because to span this entire huge length here, they needed to invent something so that there wouldn't be columns in the center of the room. So instead of hiring an architect to finish up this room, they hired the ship makers. That's what they're good at, is building ships. And so these arches up here, the trusses, were actually made by shipbuilders. So it's basically a giant hull of a ship. That's what the roof is. So it's very ingenious. They were some of the best ship makers in all of the world at the time. I'm interested in these arches down here, though. Look at how the water comes here, and then you have the arches. Don't you have a sense, if you kind of squint, that this block here is floating on the water? That it's almost magically levitating. Now, I want you to kind of put yourself in a different position. Think about yourself in, like, let's say the 1200s. You've never seen anything modern, and you're on a boat, and you're coming into Venice for the first time by torch. And imagine that all of these buildings are lit up with torches. Would you not imagine that this building was literally floating in the water? Now, how would you feel about the kind of people who could build a building that would levitate? Would you be afraid? I think you would be intimidated at the very least. And that's the idea. They wanted you to be intimidated by their power. And if you weren't intimidated by that, they have these two columns here. And between these two columns, they would string up anybody who disagreed with the Republic. So that helps too. Lots of billboards to tell you, don't mess with the Venetians, because that won't work out so well for you. But that's when we look at architecture, just remember that architecture is never neutral. There is no building out there that just says nothing, at least not historic architecture. All architecture is trying to tell you something. And what this building is telling you with this really strange arrangement of columns is trying to tell you about the power of that person. They're so important that they can make their palace levitate. So think about that as you're looking. There is always a reason for these odd styles. So this kind of style of architecture is also something very unique, and we call it Venetian Gothic. And you won't find it anywhere else. When you think about Gothic, Gothic is what? Notre Dame, right? You're going to think of flying buttresses and all this kind of thing. Gothic is actually kind of a derogatory term invented nonetheless by Italians, who went up to France and they saw all these churches with these flying buttresses and these arches, and they said, oh, it's so barbaric. It's like the Goths might have built it. Because remember, the Goths were barbarians. And so that's where we get the name Gothic. It was sort of slander in a way, saying, oh, Gothic, it's like barbarians built it. So this style in particular is called Venetian Gothic only because it was built around the same time as these things that were being built in the north in France. And it has pointed arches, of course. Why we call it Venetian Gothic is that we have these other funny little elements. Look at those, the little kind of quadrifoils, all of these elements that are really Eastern. So we have a huge influence from Constantinople. So that it's a mix. This is the only place you're going to see architecture that is a mix between East and West. You're going to see those two elements combining pointed arches with the kind of motifs that come typically from Islamic buildings. And so that's why you see something like that only here in Venice. Venice was a place, by the way, in the, let's say, 12 and 1300s, where you could practice any religion you wanted. They had freedom of religion, something very unusual at the time. They had different sections, neighborhoods for each of the different populations. They had a section, for instance, for the Greeks who could practice their Greek Orthodox religion. They had a Jewish ghetto. That's where the word ghetto comes from. It comes from the fact that they made coins in that area, gettone. So when you say ghetto, it was never meant to be a slanderous term. It's just that that's what they called the neighborhood where the Jews lived. So they used different neighborhoods for different ethnicities, and people could practice their own religion, which was good business because, above all, the Venetians were there to be traders. So you needed a neighborhood for each of these trading communities. You had to have the Armenian section of town because the Armenians were coming with their goods and they needed a place to live. So that's why this is an international city. It was the most cosmopolitan and international place you could be at the time. When I bring my tourists to Venice, they go to the Rialto, noon or whatever, packed to the gills with tourists, and everybody's like, oh, it's so crowded. Look at all these foreigners. Look at all, there's people from India and Asia, and I just go, yeah, this is how it should be, because this is exactly what it would have been like if you had been here in the year 1300. It would have been way overcrowded, and it would have been a completely international crowd. So the thing you see today with all the tourists, okay, maybe they have cameras now instead of silks and spices, but it would have been the same atmosphere, a cacophony of foreigners and different languages and people in different outfits from all over the world. That's what Venice was back then. So from the top of the Doge's Palace, we can kind of look out and we can see, I'm sorry, this is the church, the Doge's Palace here, and then these are those columns that they used to string people between. This is poor St. Theodore. Got to feel so sorry for him. And then this is the symbol of St. Mark. St. Mark, one of the four evangelists. Each of the evangelists is represented by an animal, and his animal is the lion with wings. This particular one is another piece we don't know where it comes from, and I don't even think it's a lion. When you look at it, it's something else, but they just sort of soldered some wings onto it, so it all works. Inside of the Doge's Palace, this is that room I was talking about. This is the room where all of the representatives from the different families would meet to vote on laws, to elect a new Doge, and so on. So they needed a big building. For our modern eyes, looking at a big space like this, that's nothing. This is a normal site. But it's really extraordinary at the time that this was built that they were able to build such an enormous space with no columns. And so that's why when you imagine above this gilded ceiling, it's the hull of a ship, of a boat. And in fact, the Venetians were such incredible shipbuilders, they were able to build a warship, one warship per day, if they wanted to. There's only one other force in the world since then that's been able to do that. Does anybody know who that is? It's us. Yeah, during World War II, we were able to pump out one warship per day. And the Venetians were able to do it 500-600 years before us. So if that gives you a scale, another scale of the wealth, just you look at this, and like I said, for our modern eyes, it's hard to understand how glorious and important this republic was. But another way to think about it is, at the time that this building was built, living in the city of Venice, 1314, 1500s, they had more than 50 people with the relative wealth of Bill Gates. Think about that. How many do we have like that living in Seattle? Not 50. We're a much bigger city. So 50 people living in this tiny city with that relative immense wealth. So this was a city of incredible wealth and importance, something that is hard to even kind of comprehend. So outside of the palace, this is the back end of the Doge's Palace, you see this beautiful bridge called the Bridge of Sighs. If you've been to Venice, I can guarantee you in your photograph collection you have a picture with your sweetheart underneath the Bridge of Sighs, probably, because everybody thinks of it as something romantic. Lord Byron talked about it as the Bridge of Sighs. It was never called that before, so we associate it with being something romantic. In fact, there's nothing romantic at all. This is the prison bridge. And the reason it was called the Bridge of Sighs is that this was the courthouse and this was the prison. And so people sentenced, usually were sentenced to death, being imprisonment and dying in the prisons most likely. And so as they would cross, they could look out of these tiny windows, and when they got their last glimpse of Venice, they would sigh with sadness. Did you think that was the story of that bridge? Most people think, oh, they sigh because lovers kiss underneath it. But no, it's got a much different meaning in the past. That's what the Bridge of Sighs is about. And that's what you were condemned to. And a lot of these cells, some of them were actually under the water line. So when the water would rise, you'd be, soaking. So it was a really miserable place. No air, no light. Unfortunately, these were used into the 20th century. It was after the time of World War II that they stopped using them. So a pretty recent change in the way we look at imprisonment. And how would you become imprisoned? This is a fun thing to try and find in Venice. You can find these little letterbox slots. And what you could do, it says, basically, how would you say in English? Accusations, secret accusations. So if you saw somebody doing something you didn't like, so-and-so is not paying their income taxes. You could write a secret accusation and fold it up, and then you could put it into the mouth here. And that way then whoever it was could be investigated. And this is how justice worked. That's how their justice system worked, is they didn't really have a police force per se. The people were deputized to be a police force, and they would accuse people, and then they'd have a hearing, and they'd find out whether or not it was correct. And they had different kinds of faces based on what kind of an accusation you were going to do. If it was a face like this, it was usually a personal accusation. And then if there's one that was a lion, and you put it into the lion's mouth, it was an accusation against somebody who was practicing espionage or treason against the state. So you had to behave pretty well back then, I would say, because anybody could accuse you of anything, and then they'd have a court trial. So that's how justice worked back in the past. One other piece of art I just want to take a look at before we move on is this one. This is on the outside of the church of St. Mark. And it's one that everybody walks by and nobody thinks anything about, because it's, again, this patchwork of all these kind of things they stole from Constantinople. But it's an important piece. This is called the Four Tetrarchs. When the Roman Empire was breaking down, it was because it became way too big. And back then we didn't have phones and texting and all of that, so the person who's trying to control these big territories wasn't anywhere close to the lands that they were trying to rule. And so one of the emperors decided to break it into 4 parts, the job into 4 parts, 2 emperors with 2 junior emperors underneath. And so this is one of the very few images ever of those 4 tetrarchs. Do you think it worked? Mm-hmm. No, not so much. Because who wants to share power? Nobody wanted to share power. And when they split it up between 4 people, it just didn't end up working. So it was an arrangement that didn't last very long. But it's just an example of these pieces of art that when you walk through Venice, you wouldn't even notice it. But this is the only existing example we have of a portrait of the 4 tetrarchs in the world. That's a really important piece of art, and people just walk right by it. And that's, I think, a good example of how rich the city of Venice is. It's an open-air museum. I don't even tell people to go to museums. When I have groups, I say, don't bother. Don't spend money on a museum. Walk. Just walk, and you're going to see the history. It's a big open-air museum. And that's kind of what we're doing today, is having our little open-air walk. So you have heard that Venice floods, right? Now, this is a big thing that people don't quite understand. Venice has always had floods and problems. It's a city built on water, of course, and everybody thinks the reason that we get this high water, acqua alta, is because Venice is sinking. Well, it is true Venice is sinking, but we have a bigger problem, and that's the thing that we're not supposed to believe exists anymore, climate change. The Venetians believe climate change exists, and I'll tell you why. It's because when I started working as a tour guide, the city would flood 90 days a year. And when I speak about flood, it can only be this much water in St. Mark's, a tiny bit of water, but they consider that a flood. Now it's about 180 days, just in the time that I have been a tour guide. So that means the seas are getting higher and higher, and the city is having more and more of a problem. But it doesn't flood the way you probably imagine. I imagined when I started working there that, the water washes in like a wave over the quay and then floods the main square. No, it's much more insidious than that. The water bubbles up in between the stones in the main square. It's like the blob. It's kind of slow and quiet. I was once with a group, and we were down at this end of the square, and we were walking across the square quite slowly. We were having a hard time that day getting across the square. By the time we got across the square, there was so much water in the square we couldn't cross back with dry feet again. The water was already a couple of inches deep. And let me tell you, you don't want to step in that water. And that's not because the lagoon water is dirty. The lagoon water actually is fairly clean. It's because it's coming up through the sewer, it's coming up through drains, it's coming up through the rats' nests and things like that. So if you ever see the water like that, you don't want to play in it. Although I always see the backpackers out there splashing and running around and having a good time in it. And I think, yeah, that's why hostels are so dirty. There you go. It can get really, really deep though. And most locals will own these hip boots. Do you see how this woman has on these hip boots? One of my girlfriends, she lives in Cannaregio, which is a district that floods quite a bit. And I was over at her house one night, and I heard this kind of siren. It sounds like an air raid siren, and it freaked me out. I'm like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And she goes, oh, it just means we're having a really high water tonight. I had just walked to her house from my hotel, and half hour later, I said, okay, I'm going to go back to my hotel now. And she said, oh, wait, let me give you boots. And I said, oh, don't worry. I just came from my hotel. It's fine. And so I refused the boots. And I walked home. I walked back to my hotel. And by the time I got there, the water was about knee deep. And I learned right then, you never refuse rubber boots from a Venetian. That was a really big error because they know when it's going to flood and flood a lot. So this is a problem in Venice, is that the rising waters coming from global warming are consistently flooding the city more and more. So if you don't think that global warming has an effect, I can guarantee you, I've seen it myself, it has a big effect. And it doesn't happen at the times you might think. The reasons it usually happens is that when you saw that map, you could see Venice was at the crook of the leg, like kind of if you're looking at my leg as the leg of Italy, it's like here, right? The thing is that the Adriatic curves right there. So when there's a wind that comes from the south, it pushes water up into the lagoon. That and low pressure allows the sea to rise, and then global warming, just a higher volume of water. So this is a problem that's never going away, and they have a real issue. They have to put these planks out now. These are these boards that they put out, and they'll put high walkways. And I have an app on my phone that shows me where all the platforms are located, so that if I need to get back to my hotel, I can find a route to get there. But I love that they've put these onto all the planks. Venice belongs to the water, not to you. Just to remind you that the water is a powerful force. So what are they going to do? This is one of the ideas. This is something that has been under construction, and I think it's insane, but what do I know? It's called the Moses Project. And they have spent billions of dollars. It should have been done probably 10 years ago, and it's still not completed. And in fact, the mayor of Venice went to jail last year for embezzling money from the project, of course. So who knows if it'll ever get done. It's being actually executed by a Dutch firm with money from the European Union. And the idea is to build these doors that are going to lay on the seabed, and then when there's an acqua alta, they know it. They always know because they can predict that they raise these gates, and they keep the water from entering the lagoon. So that's kind of a diagram of how it works. So they are actively building this. They have finished one section. I think it's completely nuts because water is always going to find a way to get in. I mean, really, think about that. If the water doesn't go into the lagoon, where is it going to go? It's going to probably flood the islands that are attached to these barriers, or it's going to go up north and it's going to hit one of the cities like Trieste, for instance, which is the next big city in the Adriatic. I think it's completely bonkers, but there it is. That's the actual project. They have built it. And I've seen the gates being tested up and down. So this is what they're trying. Keep an eye on the news for this, because this is something that's current events. And as they start to use it, there will probably be more news coverage. But I just can't imagine how this is going to work. But this is the plan. This is how they're going to try and save the city. So thinking about happier news, Venice is a city that is just so enjoyable, especially taking a gondola. I know that this is such a terrible cliche. Everybody sort of thinks, oh, gondolas, oh, that's so cheesy. I'm not going to do that. And I have to tell you, every time I travel with groups, there's always at least one person, usually not a woman, just for some reason, who says, why would you spend money on that? That's so touristy. And I always just say, look, you're never coming back to Venice as far as you know. Just spend the money. It's a ridiculous amount of money, but spend the money and give it a shot. Because here's the thing. The city was not meant to be seen by foot. I told you earlier that the city is 118 individual islands. In the past, there were no bridges. So when you built a palace back in the year 12 or 1300, you didn't build it with your front door on the piazza. You built it on the canal because that's the street. Just makes sense. So when you just walk, you never actually see the front of buildings. You never actually see the city the way the city was intended to be seen by the people who built it. So in fact, you're getting a really false sense of the city. And the gondola is cheesy. Oh my gosh, it's cheesy. Oh my gosh, it's overpriced like you would not believe. But you know what? It's kind of awesome. I kind of love it. And I have never had a single person in all of these years, and I've taken over 1,000 people, I'm sure, on a gondola ride. I've never had a single person ever say they regret it. So it's just one of those things you have to just buck up and pay the money. You already paid $10,000 to get there. What's another $50? So I think it's well worth it, and it's something that, yeah, you can't help but just love it. I don't know how many times I've gone on a gondola now, but I'm still romanced every time. Of course, I'm such a cheese ball. I always have an opera singer come with us. So, you know, you got to do it and have a good time. But of course, the gondoliers